All right. Foundation of Civic Life. We're here at the Gerald R. Ford. And that's him. He played for Michigan Wolverines, and he won 2 national titles. And he played center for the Michigan Wolverines. And I'm here with Patty. How many presidential libraries have we visited?
Well, we tried. Our goal is to hit them all.
Well, I've hit more than you.
Not by much.
And we haven't videotaped them all, but we did videotape the George Bush Presidential Library that had a piece of the 9/11. And then right down here, they have a big chunk of the Berlin Wall that's supposedly worth $500 an inch or something like that. So that piece of concrete right there is worth millions of dollars, believe it or not. And anyway, Gerald Ford is one of the most interesting presidents because he was never elected by the people, either as vice president or president, because Nixon's vice president was Spiro Agnew, I think, and he decided he didn't want to be vice president, so then they had Ford come in. So he was never elected on a ticket to be the vice president or the president, which is the distinction of only Gerald Ford. And here's baby pictures. But he was born in Nebraska and
Under a different name.
soon moved to right here where we're at, which is Grand Rapids, Michigan. And you can see, I don't know what river that is. I think it's the Hudson River, maybe, but I'm not sure. And the Presidential Library is absolutely beautiful. And here's a statue of him right here as a Boy Scout. And you can see that right there, Boy Scout of America. And you know what's really interesting? You see his hair. He had a nice flock of hair. But most people know Gerald Ford as being pretty much bald. Not like completely bald, but... And you know, this is an interesting fact that probably no one has ever said before. But he's the last president that has been essentially bald. Because the president that preceded him was Jimmy Carter. And then after that was Ronald Reagan. And we know what incredibly nice hair he had. And then after that was George Bush. And then it was Clinton. And then it was the other George Bush. And then it was Barack Obama. And then it was Donald Trump. And then it was Joe Biden. So I guess I take that back because Joe Biden essentially is... I take that back. So, but all the presidents, you know, from Gerald Ford on, had a big giant flock of hair. And I guess this is like photographs, and he was definitely an athlete. And here's Gerald Ford playing football. Apparently there's some trophies. Now what's really interesting about Gerald Ford is he was offered a contract by 2 NFL teams to play in the NFL, and he declined that to go to Yale to finish his law degree. And he was obviously a very bright student, and he graduated from Michigan, but then went on to Yale to pursue a law degree. And look at that, Ford paint, varnish, and enamels. Now when you go around this town here, there's a lot of streets and buildings named after Ford. And you know what I'm guessing this is? This is a picture of the exact site we're on right here, looking out over the river. You can see it right there. Interesting. Obviously, he was a big supporter of the Boy Scouts. And it says he became an Eagle Scout. Now, look at over here. Here's his football uniforms or replicas, whichever one it really is. And there you have it. Now this is pretty interesting here, is they have this football right here where it says Michigan versus Georgia State, number 9 versus number 2. And this game is very interesting because of this guy right here. And I don't know his name. Okay, it's Willis Ward. He was a black player that played for Michigan. And I'm not 100%, but Georgia Tech refused to play Michigan if he played. And this was Gerald Ford's best friend and his roommate in Michigan. So Michigan ended up playing the game, but Gerald Ford refused to play the game because his friend was not allowed to play. And his friend encouraged him to play, and so he did. Gerald Ford, speaking of that, was a president that believed in a lot of civil rights type of things, and he signed a lot of legislation as president in that regard. And he also signed an Equality Act, meaning like for women or anyone to have their same exact rights, which led to a lot of things, like in the NCAA, where you had to have the same amount of sports for women or men, or the same amount of scholarships. I don't know the exact details of all that, but that's essentially, I think, some of the things that were done. Before law school, after his first season of coaching, Ford, he became a coach after he was a full-time coach. And that's one of the reasons why he almost didn't get accepted into Yale as law school, because he had a full-time coaching position. And look at that. And there's Ford right there. And he attended law school at Yale while coaching at Yale. There you go. Ford would be considered a very middle of the road president, or Republican. He wasn't a hard right. He was middle, very middle. There's also a aircraft carrier dedicated and named after him, the Gerald Ford. And they're saying that this particular statue is on board that ship. It says, resting on the ship's scooper. Huh. Now, he also served in World War II, and he was in the Navy. And I think he trained flight school. And he also participated in the Battle of, I want to say the Philippine Sea, maybe. Not 100%. And over here you'll see the actions he was involved in. Oh, he was also involved in the typhoon that hit the fleet, that sank a bunch of the ships. And you can see right here, he was on this ship right here, the USS Monterey, which was an aircraft carrier. And it was hit by the typhoon, and a fire broke out. And they did manage to save the ship, but I don't think it was ever able to be serviceable again. And there's the ship he served on. And he was an officer. And he volunteered. Now, one of the things you'll notice about this aircraft carrier, it looks like a battleship, right? Because it was about halfway through the war that they realized that battleships were pretty much obsolete already and they needed aircraft carriers. So they started taking ship hulls and turning them into aircraft carriers. And that would definitely be a ship that he was on that had started life. It was going to be something other than an aircraft carrier. It says he returned to Grand Rapids in 1946 and turned his attention to politics. And he became a congressman, as you see right here.
In the spring of 1943, he's assigned to a light aircraft carrier, the USS.
Now check this out. I'm going to go back here and look at this.
By November 1943,
there's a screen that tells you about his service in World War II. And what's interesting is once that is done playing, you'll see through it. And I think you see a plane back there. A couple other quick facts about Gerald Ford is he fought World War II. He was a lawyer. And he also married Betty Ford. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Who became famous, obviously because she was the first lady, but because she got a mastectomy while in office, while he was president, I believe. And then she became an alcoholic. And she was instrumental in opening the Betty Ford Clinic, which is the most famous clinic in the world for rehabilitation from drug and alcohol abuse. And it's still there today as a non-profit, the Betty Ford Clinic. Yeah, so the Battle of the Philippine Sea. I think he enlisted in the Navy in 1942 and was in the Navy until 1946 or 1947. And if you want, look up this Typhoon Cobra. It did more damage to the U.S. Navy than the Japanese did, basically. It sank a lot of ships, damaged a lot of ships. Wow.
75 knots and monstrous waves showed the carrier hard to port. 4 planes snapped their cables, careening off the side. At 9:11 a.m.,
that would have been scary.
Violent ship rolls, planes in the hangar deck below break loose from their cables, crashing into one another, puncturing gas tanks, creating sparks, and starting a fire that quickly spread. Alarms sounded throughout the ship.
I'm only watching this to see what's on the other side of that screen. Now look at it, that's the ship. I mean, you would think it would sink. Wow.
Just as he was going overboard, his foot caught the raised lip at the deck's edge, slowing his slide and allowing him to throw himself onto a catwalk below. Ford recovers and makes his way to the bridge, where he learns of the magnitude of the Monterey's troubles. The gasoline-fed fire threatens munitions.
Amazing.
Ventilation shafts dump thick smoke into boiler rooms, forcing most of the engineering crew to abandon them. The Monterey had lost power.
So you're learning all about the Monterey ship, which is that ship right over there. I don't believe it was ever able to go back into service. So obviously it would have been scrapped.
By 10:30, the
And
began to turn. The fires were extinguished, and the ship
that looks like a Wildcat back there.
Within an hour,
And let's see, this says Gerald Ford's congressional desk. So he was, Ford used this desk in his office in Grand Rapids. Many of his mementos, papers, and other desk items were seen like in photos. When people would take photos, it was from this desk, apparently. I'm going to come back over there. And this is just photos of Ford's life. Now, you know, one of the things, and this is his wife, Betty Bloomer, That was her original name before she married him and became Ford. And here's a dress that apparently she wore when she got married. You know what? That video ended, and they did not light up that plane that's back there. Anyway, there's a couple really interesting things about Ford. There's a lot of stuff that was going on while he was president. The Vietnam War was still going on. You had the Nixon situation. And you had massive recession in the country. It was like bordering on depression. And he had to deal with all that when he became the president, when Nixon resigned. And one of the most controversial things, this is saying that when Ford first arrived at Congress, he was assigned to Public Works Committee. President Truman had implored the committee to appropriate funds to renovate the dilapidated White House. This was a piece of the White House from when the British tried to burn it to the ground. Wow, that's really interesting. One of the things that Ford did, and I'm going to bring up politics today, because Ford and current politics really intercept. Because Nixon was facing an impeachment, and he decided to resign rather than be impeached. And for those who don't know what Watergate is, it's essentially the Republican Party was spying on the Democratic Party, and they had set up surveillance and other things. And it wasn't really that big of a deal, because, you know, they essentially denied that the president knew anything about it. Do you see that right there? That car, that's a Dodge Challenger. But it was a big deal as people kept investigating it. Essentially, the Washington Post kept investigating it. And then you see Nixon visiting China. And they basically found out that Nixon knew about it. Or, I don't know that I don't think that Nixon planned it or anything, but he found out about it and then decided to cover it up. It says right here, Nixon denies role in cover-up, admits abuse by subordinates. So I don't think Nixon knew anything about this. I may be wrong. But he definitely found out about it, and he tried to cover it up. And so he decided to leave, and Ford became the president. And this big decision Ford had to make was whether or not to pardon Nixon. And this was a huge decision, and he listened to everybody on it, because he had to decide whether it was better for the country to pardon Nixon or to put the country through just, investigations after investigations, and it would go on for years and years and years. It would be very partisan. It would rip the country apart, very similar to what's going on today with Donald Trump. Gerald Ford was heavily criticized for pardoning Nixon. And he gave a speech to the entire nation, and basically said that it was time to move on, and that the acts or deeds of one person can't dictate an entire country. They were dealing with the end of the Vietnam War. They were dealing with recession. They were dealing with the Soviet Union. You remember that was the Cold War. You're dealing with a lot of problems. And do you really need to deal with this? And so historians have decided that he did the right thing. Look at this. This is the letter. I hereby resign the office of the President of the United States, Richard Nixon. There it is. Unbelievable. Wow. There's the letter, and it's dated 11:35 a.m. And here is Nixon walking out of the building. Now, Ford knew when he pardoned Nixon that could hurt him politically, but he did it anyway. Now, some say that there was an agreement that Nixon would resign and Ford would become president if Ford would pardon him. In other words, let's get him out of here and let's move on, because there's bigger fish to fry. And it does not really matter. But Ford knew that it was going to hurt him drastically to do that, but he did it anyway. And history shows he did the right thing. And when you look at what's going on today, with all this partisan politics, and you have to be literally brain dead not to understand that they have been after Donald Trump before he even could get into the White House. They were after him after he got nominated. They were spying on him. They literally launched investigations about Russia, which was false. They impeached him twice. New York has literally taken laws they've never used against anyone, to take him to court. These are things that, he probably did. But nobody would ever, whether he was president or not, a normal citizen would have never gone through these kinds of things. Because these are little trivial things that you don't spend millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars of public money to try. It's ridiculous. But we are in partisan politics right now. And you know what Mitt Romney said? He said that, and he hates Donald Trump, but he said that Biden should just pardon Donald Trump to show that he's the bigger man and spare the country this nonstop nonsense. But, partisan politics is where we're at today. Now, one of the things you'll see here, because it says protecting the Ford family, there was 2 assassination attempts on Ford's life, and they were both by women. And both of them got life sentences, and but eventually they got out of prison. And you'll see a gun right here. Before Pham could fire the shot, the Secret Service confiscated the semi-automatic pistol, and there it is. They tried to assassinate him twice, and they failed both times. And this is a replica of the Oval Office when he was president. Now, every president gets to choose the carpet, the color of the walls, the curtains. But this is what it would have looked like when he was here. Now, here's a couple of other interesting facts about Ford. After he became president and he ran for re-election, he had someone that ran against him, and it was Ronald Reagan. And he beat Ronald Reagan. And he went on to lose a very close race to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter has gone down as what many consider the worst modern day president. And he presided over all kinds of problems. An oil embargo, Iran hostage crisis, recession. It was unreal. Now, when Ford was president, he was dealing with a lot of the same issues he was dealing with the end of the Vietnam War. And one of the things that he did to stimulate the economy and inflation. That's another reason why Nixon is, not Nixon, but Ford is so closely tied to what's going on today, because today you have out of control inflation, and that was something they were dealing with. So it says Ford changed his strategy away from fighting inflation to battling recession instead. He worked with Congress to craft a bipartisan stimulus spending bill that included key tax cuts while pursuing an economic policy described by journalists as cautious. Now, another thing that's really interesting about Ford is there's a big issue today too, of abortion. And he signed, and by the way, I'm not 100% on all this, but he signed something into law that allowed the states to decide for themselves. So prior to that legislation, it was a federal decision, and then it became a state decision. And then there was Roe versus Wade, and then there was a Supreme Court challenge that basically reverted back to its state decision. That's why some states have abortion and others do not, or they have very restrictive abortion. The other thing that was interesting about Ford as it relates to today is that Ford was having a lot of problems walking and stumbling like Joe Biden. And then you can see him right there falling. Now, Ford lived to be in his 90s, I believe. And he worked right here every day. Now, see, there's Chevy Chase. Now, do you know what the relation between Chevy Chase and Ford is? That Chevy Chase, when he was on Saturday Night Live, he made, he was only there for 1 year. And it was when Ford was president, and he would constantly fall, and he would do his own stunts. He would constantly fall. And that was to mock Ford. It says, took office, relations between the media and president were at an all-time low. Okay. Probably because of Watergate. And because, and then here it is. It says, years after his presidency, Ford hosted a conference of presidential humor and invited Chevy Chase Left, the Saturday Night Live comedian, who enjoyed portraying President Ford as clumsy. Well, Ford will not go down as the most clumsy president. Obviously, that's going to be Joe Biden. I don't think we've ever seen anything like it. But we haven't seen anything like it since President Ford. So if you think it's unfair what's happening to Joe Biden, go back and research Ford, because he had a lot of the same problems, and he was not nearly as old as Joe Biden. And here is a replica of the White House. I guess this is like some of his golf clubs. His life in the White House. Now, I think Ford died in 2006. And his wife died a few years later. And by the way, they're both buried here. And we're going to go see their final burial location. Ford was a very important president. He did a lot of things in a short period of time. And, unfortunately, one of the main things that he was known for was pardoning Nixon, which ultimately turned out to be the right decision. And then this is a game ball given to Ford after her mass oh my God, I can't believe it. I'm not even going to try to say it. Sometimes I stumble on words too. Just, it is what it is. Let's see. And here's some outfits worn by Betty Ford. And some medals. And they say that he had a great relationship with Jimmy Carter all the way up until his death. Who was his predecessor? Taking on energy, an Arab oil embargo caused fuel shortages. And you can freeze and you can read these things. Reducing dependency on foreign oil, Ford hoped to reduce oil imports by 1 million barrels a day. He moved to deregulate domestic energy production, expecting that higher market prices would encourage conservation and provide incentives for exploration. Ford imposed a fee on imported oil. Under his watch, the first section of Trans-Alaska oil pipeline was laid. Offshore oil drilling increased, as did coal mining. By the time Ford left, coal was on its way to producing more of the nation's energy than oil, and a strategy had been crafted to decrease oil imports and increase domestic production. Sounds very similar to Donald Trump. And there's some of their silverware. All this stuff is very interesting. I am a big fan of history, if you hadn't noticed. And I have visited many presidential libraries. I've visited Carter, George W. Bush, and then this is the Fall of Saigon. Obviously, Ford was involved in that. And if you're not familiar with the Fall of Saigon is that Ford signed an agreement to end the United States' participation in the Vietnam War. And one of the things, the agreement provided that the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese would recognize that each had their own territory and country, and it would just end the war. And then so the North Vietnamese wanted to test that by having a couple encounters here and there. And when they noticed that the United States was not going to do anything, they decided, once the United States was pulling out, to fully invade South Korea. And what happened was Ford wanted to give military assistance to the South so they could defend themselves. And I guess Congress voted no, and no military support was given to South Vietnam, and therefore they collapsed. Very similar, and hopefully you're starting to see what I'm talking about here, very similar to the things that are going on today. Giving support to Ukraine, giving support to Israel, whether you support these things or not. I do not support giving military aid to Ukraine, and if we didn't, I think what would happen is Europe would give it to them. Instead of us giving it to them, Europe should give it to them. That's my opinion. But if no one gave support to Ukraine, they would collapse in the same way that South Vietnam collapsed when the United States refused to give military aid to South Vietnam. A lot of things are very similar, and I'll tell you another thing that's very similar. Is when Ford was president, they dealt with an epidemic. Is this all sounding like, you're living, Ford is the president today? The swine flu was an epidemic in the United States, basically to the same degree that COVID was when Trump was president. The conservative wanted Reagan as their president. A lot of Republicans did not like Ford because he was probably a little bit more middle of the road, and the hardcore conservatives didn't like that too much. I would say in the Clinton era, he would be considered a Democrat. I think Bill Clinton today would be considered a Republican because I think that Donald Trump as a Republican would be considered more of in my opinion, he'd be considered more of like a Clinton Democrat. But back then, it was really, you're really a Democrats back then, I think, were more like Republicans today.
Welcome to
And
the
Republicans
Capitol.
today
My name is Carla.
are back then were like very conservative, very hard on military, big on military.
We welcome you.
And that's Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Please take a seat
He
around
was the
table and
president.
enjoy the
And he was the
Ammunition
commander
Stone,
of
which is a replica of President
the
Ford's
forces
capture
against
in the
Germany,
White House.
and later
Here,
became
the administration
president.
Or cabinet members.
Look at this.
would meet
This is supposed to be the
routinely
cabinet
as
room.
needed
You can
to
see it
address
right
urgent
there.
matters. When the
This is
cabinet
where they would
meetings
get together
begin,
and meet
the president occupies
to
the
decide
chair.
very important things, the cabinet
Vice
room.
President
So this is a
sits opposite the
replica.
president. Each cabinet member is assigned a chair.
Unbelievable.
fixed with a brass plate.
And then here is a list of Ford's cabinet. The only cabinet member he really kept from Nixon was Henry Kissinger. But there's his cabinet. And there's a couple other people that you might remember. George H.W. Bush was in his cabinet. And another one was Rumsfeld. And I know he's in there somewhere. Yep, there he is. Because he also served for George Bush. And this talks about Gerald Ford's legacy, made all the more astonishing for many challenges he faced in his short time as president, continues to grow with judgment of history. He will be remembered for the actions he took and the good that came from them, but it will be, his attributes of his characters and principles for which he lived, honesty, integrity, selflessness, that will always endure and inspire. I'm going to actually agree, if you study these things, it will be determined that Gerald Ford should have been reelected, and I think the country would have been a lot better off than getting Jimmy Carter, who clearly was not cut out for the job. Gerald Ford probably had a very slim chance of being reelected because of the Nixon decision. It would take many decades for that decision to prove to be correct. By historians, not me. And this is the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier. Shows he was the 38th president, obviously. But there is the aircraft carrier that bears his name. This is a new aircraft carrier. I want to say it's like the newest one in the Navy. And this shows the aircraft carrier being put together. And there it is. And you can see his name is right there on the back of this aircraft carrier. So here's the thing. You literally could come in here. Oh, and Richard Cheney was obviously a part of his staff of George W. Bush from 2001 to 2000. Dick Cheney, became the vice president. And there he is. So a lot of these people date back to Ford that would later become. Let's go out and see his gravesite. And then here's a picture of Gerald Ford funeral tributes. And these are comments that people made. And then
a calm and steady hand. Gerald Ford came along when we needed him most. During his time in office, the American people came to know.
And then here's where he's buried, right here. Right inside those gates right there. That's his final resting place. And you can see right here, Ford's tomb site. He's interred on the grounds.
And the honorable conduct of his administration.
And you can see right there, there's his casket before he's entombed.
We mourn the loss of such.
And then later his wife would join him.
And our 38th president will always have a special place in our nation's memory. President Ford lived 93 years. His life was a blessing to America.
And then you can see right here
And now this fine
where he's
family
laying in the
will be
rotunda.
blessed by a family that will love him
Right there.
always. And by a nation
All right.
that will
Well,
be grateful to him forever.
And then here
May
it's
God bless.
yeah. And then this is the strange thing is he was born in Nebraska. He's known for being a Michigan man, but he died in California.
Watergate.
He lived the rest of his life in California. So let's walk down and see where he's buried. And did you learn anything?
Yeah.
What did you learn?
Well, I learned that there was 2 assassin attempts on him, both by women.
Yeah, both by women.
But it was after he had pardoned Nixon, and
That is
people were
correct.
pretty outraged by his pardoning of Nixon.
They were very. Now you know what's interesting when you think about Ford and you think about everything that's going on today. He was the president of evacuating, or basically evacuating South Vietnam. And of course Biden did the same thing in Afghanistan. He was the president over an epidemic, the swine flu, that killed tens of thousands of Americans. Trump had the same situation. All the partisanship in politics like that we see today.
I also like, the information on how
And there's
fiscally sound he was, that he actually vetoed 66 pork fat bills that came through across his desk from Congress, because he didn't want outrageous spending. He wanted to balance the budget.
and here's the gift store.
Balancing the budget seems to be a thing of the past for presidents these days, which is outrageous to me.
Yeah,
We
well,
have to balance our checkbooks, but they don't have to balance our country.
well, he was I think he was like the first president that ever operated the government. There's him with Muhammad Ali, but he was the first president, I believe, that operated with a deficit. So they had a deficit because he lowered taxes, but then he added import taxes. Same thing like Donald Trump did, like lowered taxes, but put taxes on imports. And
Wanted to name America.
well, no, it's like you just offset one tax for another, but people have the choice to buy something or not. But that's what he did. He had a lot of challenges in a short period of time, and the biggest decision was, pardoning Nixon, which basically spared the country endless and endless amounts of investigations, accusations, putting a president on trial.
I also found it interesting that his birth name was different. That he was born by a different man, by a different name, and was abusive to his mom and family, and so she left, and Ford is the remarried name. So and his original father didn't ever give a money of support to his mother, or recognize him as his own son. So I found that very interesting.
And here is the gravesite. We're going to end this video. President of the United States from 74 to 77, Vice President 73, 74, House of Representatives 49 to 73, United States Navy 42 to 46. Beyond these gates is the final resting place of our nation's 38th President, Gerald R. Ford, and his wife, Elizabeth Ford. I think Ford would have made a really good president if he would have been elected by the people and had a chance to serve a full term. But he just couldn't escape that Nixon pardon. But he did it anyway, knowing that it might affect his ability to become re-elected. And here is Lives Committed to God, Country and Love, Gerald R. Ford, 1913 to 2006, and Elizabeth Bloomer Ford, 2018 to 2011. She outlived him, and that's where they're resting. Their final resting place is right here. And I have to say that this is a very, very beautiful area dedicated to the two of them. And wow. And there you have it. There's the Gerald Ford Presidential Library. Now I have visited Truman, I have visited Ford, Reagan, George W. Bush, Jimmy Carter, and Abraham Lincoln, believe it or not, has a presidential library. It was built way after the fact, before they ever had presidential libraries, but I actually visited it. So it's actually probably the coolest one. I would say Reagan was probably maybe the coolest one, huh? The Reagan. But Abraham Lincoln is pretty amazing as well. And Abraham Lincoln is the only person that I know of that has a presidential library
I thought Truman's was really
where he's not buried there.
Truman's didn't have like the fanfare of say this building or Reagan's building, but it was really informational.
So I have to get to Biden, Clinton, the first Bush, and I don't know how many other presidential libraries there are other than that. I think Nixon has one, but it's not very big. I think the most important president, I'm not saying he's the best president, but was Truman. Because Truman had to decide about the atomic weapon. He had to rebuild Europe. He had to keep the Soviets from taking the rest of Germany. The Lend-Lease Acts. I mean, there was just so many things going on when Truman was president, and the Korean War started under Truman. There was just so much stuff going on when Truman was president. It was just a mess. But yeah, I mean, like the stress that he had to deal with, I'm sure was very high. So anyway, from Gerald Ford's Presidential Library, if you're ever in Grand Rapids, Michigan, you should come here and check it out. Did you like it?
Yes.
I would say you get a new appreciation for Ford when you realize all the stuff that was going on, because it was a lot. A swine flu, President Nixon pardon, resigning, the end of the Vietnam War, probably the most reviled war that America has ever been in. I'm talking about the citizens of America. A recession. The Soviet Union. He signed a treaty that laid the foundation for ending the Cold War, and he doesn't get credit for that in most people's minds, because they tend to forget about Gerald Ford being a president. But he signed an agreement with Russia that would help keep them from going to war and addressing their problems. Okay? And in closing, it says, I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president by your ballots, and so I ask you to confirm me as your president with your prayers. I have not campaigned either for the presidency or the vice presidency. I am indebted to no man, and only to one woman, my dear wife, as I begin this very difficult job. Gerald R. Ford. Swearing in address, August 9th, 1974. I think when you listen to those words, you realize this was a very thoughtful man. And, he got there in a way that no other president, vice president has ever done before. He's the only one. And rest in peace, Gerald Ford. Right here in Grand Rapids, Michigan.